art stuff, most of it is, so much of it is just bad. Like,
yeah, that's probably the best way to put it. Is most of the tattoos, if you were to ask someone why they had those tattoos, the answer would not be interesting or enlightening or satisfactory.
well, and just I've seen like a handful of like tattoos where I think the person doesn't just objectively look worse because of the tattoo.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like well, like the one style, like the one tattoo style that I think actually looks good is the Maori traditional, like
The original tribal style stuff.
yeah, like I don't know, and especially just on the Maoris. Like,
It almost
I think,
makes sense when you think about it. The art style that looks best for tattoos is the one that was designed with tattoos in mind.
Yeah. I think there's some pretty well done, like there's a watercolor style that I saw. There's a Canadian artist who's really good at it that my friend showed me. And that was one I thought was actually pretty solid. He showed me some of like a bunch of the guys' tats that he had done over the years. And they were all like, he'd only do custom work. And they all looked pretty good. I thought, well, there's something that, is quite a bit different than what I had normally seen, and thought it was pretty good in terms of just overall. I think a lot of that is also just the guy's ability. He's clearly extremely talented. The best is just like the generic crap that people get when they're in high school. Always gotta love.
Well, that's another point. Is the more popular tattoos get, the more like just absolute garbage artists are going to go into doing tattoos.
Yeah, that's true.
Because the demand is just going to be there, and you're just going to have like complete amateurs going like, oh, I could be a tattoo artist. Before it was probably like more serious.
I think if
artists.
you get tattooed, like spend the real money and go to a tattoo artist who is renowned for his or her work. I think if you do something like that, you should probably, just spring for it. All right, well, we are live, and after insulting a bunch of tattooed people, we can jump right into the episode. So today we're going to be taking a look at the global energy crisis. So everybody is, of course, aware of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, and I'm sure the issues of power to Europe is widely known, basically. But I think a lot of people don't realize that there's quite a bit more going on under the surface that isn't as well known in terms of just globally. There's a huge shortage of power, and that kind of spans basically all regions except for a few. And so we want to take a look at what's going on there and what are the implications for your regular Joe and Jane across the globe. All right, Hubbards, do you want to kick her off with a bit of a foray into the basics?
Well, I think the most important like point about energy is that it's the basis of economic growth. I mean, there's not actually, interestingly enough, economics doesn't really consider energy that much in modeling and in modern economics at all, really. It's just kind of like seen as a periphery input a lot of the time. But if you look at if you go and look at the like macro picture of the last like 200 years in particular, GDP growth and energy utilization is just so tightly linked. It's almost unavoidable to say that there's some sort of intertwined relationship. And like I think the best way to just think about it is in terms of physics at the end of the day, because most of what we want in terms of economic output requires work, and work requires energy in some form or another. And that meant prior to the Industrial Revolution, basically human and animal calories and biomass, just burning stuff. And then
Occasional watermill.
Yeah, more or less those things. And then since about 1850, GDP growth has taken off, and so has energy utilization. And the interesting thing about, like, economists have looked at the last 150 years with exponential growth, and your general macroeconomic analysis basically breaks down aggregate production into two factors: human labor and physical capital. So machines and land and that kind of thing that humans use to make stuff. If you actually go and empirically study the exponential growth over the last 150 odd years, what you see is physical capital and human labor alone explain only a small portion of the aggregate production function, like the increases in GDP output. So there's actually interesting work done to look at energy's role in explaining the remainder of that increase in economic growth. And what was found is basically, in a simplified form, that energy efficiency over the last 150 years is the main driving force behind GDP growth over that same period. And the technological innovation that explains the bulk of it is the electric motor. So if you go and look at economic growth across the globe, what you'll see in, like, particularly the US, is that yes, GDP growth started to increase in the, say, early 1800s with the first industrial revolution, but it really spikes, and there's a clear demarcation around like 1940, 1950, and that's the introduction of the electric motor. So the reason the electric motor is so important is because it's extremely efficient in converting basically generated power into useful work. So that's what efficiency is you're taking your primary energy inputs, coal, gas, whatever, it doesn't really matter, and then you're converting them into useful work for yourself. And that efficiency before, like in the early period around 1850, that efficiency was under 10%. It was about 5 to 10%, somewhere in there. And now it's hovering around 20 to 25%, with a big chunk of that being attributable to the electric motor, which is 70 to 90% efficient. So especially in like manufacturing and production things, obviously the electric motor is going to get utilized a lot to generate mechanical drive, and that's going to be highly efficient. So that's where you get a lot of your economic growth. And if you go and look at, so economists have now looked at modeling the GDP growth with the correction to capital for this increase in efficiency. And what they've seen is the gap closes basically to zero. So you can model GDP growth with corrected capital for efficiency pretty much with how it actually happened. And so that's like the reason energy is so important, is it's so tightly linked to economic growth. And if, to further extend that logic, is economic growth, our whole financial system and, a lot of our societal structures are still predicated on continued economic growth. So, if you look at debt markets and lending and that kind of thing, the whole reason that the debt cycle works is because, you're lending out money on the expectation that economic growth is positive, and therefore in the future there will be an increased amount of economic output that will provide the base for repaying that debt at a broad macroeconomic scale. So if there is shaky ground in terms of the energy situation, that also throws the economic situation into question to a large degree, and that's not a factor that's often taken into account by a lot of, like, I get what you call neoclassical economic theory. They just kind of discard energy as a commodity or an interesting periphery input that doesn't play a key role in terms of driving broad scale long-term economic growth.
I think the thing I found most interesting about that analysis was the idea of efficiency and how it has historically increased so much, because there are quite a few, I don't know what school they'd belong to, but they're basically naively optimistic, I would say, economists right now who think that efficiency increases brought about by AI and other sort of information technology is going to see us go into the next step of sort of economic evolution, the fourth industrial revolution, I think they're calling it. And that there actually is some precedent for just the importance that they put on efficiency rather than it being a new thing.
Yeah, and I mean, the same economist that was doing the work on this energy analysis also did contemplate that. I think there is a potential there, and I don't think it's crazy to see better allocation of resources, more efficient allocation of resources. I am slightly skeptical that will translate into the type of growth that you'd want for an economic system that ours is, right? Like I think you would need some sort of transition in terms of economic system and financial systems to account for that, because information technology won't necessarily mean you're making more in terms of just physics, because it's not an increase in the amount of physical work that can be done. It's just the physical work being allocated better, right? Which
for
is
instance,
a bit different.
I know one big application that has happened is in China. They're using a lot of AI building dams to generate electricity, and they can basically build a dam twice as quickly and at a lower cost than using humans. Well, I think there might be humans involved at this point still, but not to nearly the same degree. Like the AI drives the dump truck and dumps the cement at the right time to get the right cooling and all that sort of good stuff that humans are not really cut out for.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of the preamble in terms of why I think energy is like a primary concern, because our current system, the way it is, relies on increased energy utilization. I mean, taking a step back, if you just look at, like, aside from efficiency, obviously energy use has grown exponentially as well during the 1850 to present day time frame as well. And part of that's population, but part of that's just energy per person has also gone up significantly. And the majority of that being fossil fuel use, coal, oil, natural gas, and again, a lot of that was starting around the same time as the efficiency increases. Like the oil really came into its own in around the 1950 time period. So it's been a double whammy, I guess, of increased amounts of just energy, but also increased efficiency of energy. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that both of those things right now are stalling out. Like the amount of total energy available is kind of starting to hit a ceiling, especially from oil and other fossil fuels. Like we've started to hit a bit of a cap, and also efficiency gains have stalled out over the last 30, 40 years. There is some hope that increasing electrification could help bring a revival of efficiency gains back. And, main example that you could actually see today would be electric vehicles. They use electric motors. They're much more efficient than combustion engines in terms of turning your energy source into actual useful mechanical drive. Just a better system to do that. So that, we could see increasing electrification come about, but we still do have the issue of where populations continuing to grow and total energy available is not growing along with it in the same way that it has since like the 1950s.
Yeah, I kind of think that's a good segue into like the current situation. Basically, from like what I was looking at, we're starting to hit, there was that term that was being thrown around probably like 10, 15, probably even 20 years ago, quite a bit, like the peak oil. And it does appear like we're starting to get into that spot. And so a part of one of the things that appears to be driving the current energy crisis is we just don't have the same level of production, like even just prior to COVID. There are multiple factors here, but prior to COVID, we kind of hit peak production and it hasn't come back, even though demand is now back up again to what it was before or even higher. And so it does appear a good chunk of that is that peak production where oil reservoirs have kind of been tapped. Like a lot of the easy oil when the States really started like drilling and pulling oil out of the ground, a lot of it came up pretty easy because you're finding the easy to grab stuff that didn't cost a lot. And now we're into the area where in the States, but other places as well, like globally, it's harder and harder to pull the oil out of the ground. So you're not able to just ramp up production nearly as well as you could before. Basically, a oil well follows, when you're extracting oil, it follows like a bell curve. Like the first half is pretty easy to pull out all the oil, and then the second half it starts getting worse and worse in terms of like your ability to cheaply pull out the oil. And now, because of that, a lot more of the oil that's coming up now is the harder to get stuff, like fracking is one of the big things that's really expensive. And because of that, I think you're starting to see the effects that people were worried about with peak oil now actually starting to come to fruition.
I'll push back on that a little because like there's definitely potential, like a lot of potential to produce more oil than we're currently producing. But I would say the biggest concern is the economic side for these oil companies, because you don't make a new well or start drilling and exploring. That's another big thing, is exploring. There's still tons of areas on Earth that probably have a ridiculous amount of oil. Funny enough, the last really big finds were in Russia. But there's a ton of oil that hasn't been explored. But exploring, you're looking like 50, 60 years out. And even drilling a new well in an area that has oil, you're projecting 50 years probably of producing out of that well. I know of projects in Canada that were finished in 2012, and they're finished on the premise that over the next 50 years, the average price of a barrel of oil will be around $100 US. And if you're looking at a world that's trying to push towards net zero, you can't be looking at a 50-year time frame for your wells anymore, because they might have to be shuttered before then. So, and there might be some more
big piece of this where it's like regulations and whatnot. Like companies hate, they hate uncertainty. You're not going to invest the capital required. I do think that there's still like a part of the problem with, it still relates to like the easy to access oil is no longer there. And so you do have to do all of the heavy investment in trying to get that, like the next big chunk of, the next big plot of oil and being able to extract that. But yeah, exactly. As you said, if a country is going to say, yeah, we're going to be shutting you down, no company is going to say, well, we're not going to recoup our costs, so screw it. I'm not investing anything. Like we're just not going to do anything about it.
it's true that the like capital intensity wise, there's nothing easy. It is easy in the sense that they could do it if they wanted to, but it costs way more. It's not just drilling a hole in the ground and watching the oil gush up like the Saudis.
Yeah,
But
and it used to be like that in the States, but that's part of what I was saying is that type of oil is gone from the U.S. Now it's a lot harder to you actually have to put a lot more resources into pulling out the oil or gas because most of those reserves have been depleted because they were easy comparatively, and so now you actually need to invest quite a bit more money. And you need the price of oil to be at a certain amount to even go after them.
yeah, to put a dollar sign on that, Saudi oil costs them roughly $3 to $5 American to make a barrel. So they need it to be over that price to make money, which is not very difficult. And then American shale oil costs about 25 to 30 American a barrel to produce. And this is all once you have the well in place. So setting up the well also costs extra money. So therefore, but if you're building a new well, it's going to be more like $60 oil, whereas once it's running, you need $30 oil to make it make sense to keep it running. And the thing is, we're just way above all of these price points, but there's nobody who has the certainty in the economic future to be willing to invest the capital because they don't know if they'll even be allowed to continue running their oil fields in 10 years.
Yeah, and you saw that here in Canada where I think it was Husky, or it was one of the big oil companies. They just pulled the plug a few years back on one of their big projects, and it was due to these regulations, right, where they were just uncertain that the government wasn't just going to, axe their ability to even extract the oil and gas 20 years down the road. So they pulled out and they went to the States.
A big problem in Canada is that we have too much extraction potential for the export potential that we have already. Like, there's no reason to develop more extraction in Canada because there's no way to get that extracted oil to market and sell it.
Yeah, because
why? Like, why even bother?
Over to Europe, and we don't have the pipelines, and we don't have the tankers.
Well, we can't even get it to America, let alone Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
We can't even get it within Canada in a lot of cases.
Well, I think
it just becomes crazy.
I think the main, I guess, like, oil is a huge part of the overall energy picture. It's, I think it's the number one energy source in the world still. But I think like the broader context of like the energy crisis is just more or less like how on a knife's edge the supply and demand of total energy is. And again, oil is a huge part of that because it's, not every country produces oil. So lots of places import their oil, and therefore it's like one of the more, politically fraught commodities. But I think a lot of people who have grown up in the last, say, 20, 30 years, there hasn't been much for an energy crisis since the 70s, roughly.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of hard for people to imagine, like, I think people have more or less forgotten how important energy is to the economy. And it's not just, it's like food, it's like food where if you have a shortfall of energy for even a month, it's not like, oh, big deal, we'll make it up in the next quarter. It's going to cause huge problems, right? Like that's the problem with energy. It's the same thing as food. Timing is everything, right? So you can't just, take the hit and be 5% down on your supply versus demand and be like, okay, we can, we'll do it next quarter or whatever. You're going to get screwed from that because, people can't heat their homes. They can't do all the things they're used to doing. It's going to cause social unrest. It's going to cause economic collapse. And a lot of the, say it's going to have like second order effects all the way through your economy. If say you're, just one example I can think of is aluminum producers. Aluminum is a highly energy intense sector. It takes a ton of energy to produce aluminum, but there's inertia in the aluminum production process. So if you have unreliable energy production because your demand outstrips supply, and you have to shut down your aluminum facility for a month, it can take.
You have to drill out the pots, and then you're screwed because the aluminum solidifies inside the pots, and then you're completely fucked. That's a huge disaster.
It's millions and millions and millions of dollars to get that restarted, and that's like like that you can. There's examples of that across the entire economy, right? And even in the production of energy itself, like Russia has an issue where if they're not exporting their oil, they only have such a certain amount of storage capacity for the production. If they exceed that storage capacity, they have to start shuttering their wellheads. Well, they have issues with permafrost in a lot of the places where the wells are located, and that can actually permanently damage or even destroy some of their wells if they have to shutter them because they're not getting the flow throughs, and the permafrost can just wreak havoc. And then your future capacity is undermined. So I think the energy situation is such that we've taken it for granted for the last while that we just have like reliable energy that is always meeting the demand. The supply is always exceeding demand, and that allows for a lot of other efficiencies and benefits in the global economy, because if you're a aluminum producer, you don't have to think what happens next month if I have to shut down and restart, and therefore you can make these investments, make these decisions with some degree of certainty in mind. And if any of that, if that starts to go the other way, and now you're all of a sudden in a situation where energy supply is unstable and unreliable, it creates huge problematic knock-on effects for the rest of the economy. So it's more than just people are going to have to pay a higher price for the energy for a while. It can actually just blow out supply chains and hamper globalized trade and all sorts of other things that will take months or years to work through the system detrimentally. And so you really, really, really want to keep the energy supply reliable and in excess of demand for our current system. Our system is just not resilient to energy shocks.
And speaking of investing, one stat that I've seen a few times is that right now the investment in new energy projects is about half of what anyone thinks needs to be invested to reach the goals of net zero by 2050. So it doesn't seem like there's a good sense of throwing money at the problem yet.
It's just a carry on of business as normal, not really taking it as seriously as they should.
Well, and renewables have all their problems with consistency, but in the end, more energy is more energy, which would help out with the problem. But it's only during this shock from the Russia-Ukraine war that the Germans have considered not shutting down the last of their nuclear reactors that were supplying more than 10% of the country's power in a completely reliable and steady fashion. It's a lot of this seems to be just almost short-sightedness.
Yeah, humans and short-sightedness, not a surprise. But I think, like we saw with the pandemic, people are very short-sighted, and they also have very short memories. And I think, again, that comes back to the energy problem. It just has been a long time since the world had an energy problem. And again, we do have climate change as an issue. And I think people got taking it for granted that, the energy system just worked. And like Germany again, I think is a great example, making all sorts of decisions, compromise decisions in terms of trying to move towards a greener economy, but still keep the energy grid going business as usual in terms of delivering enough power. But then what did they have to compromise on? Well, then they're getting a huge chunk of their energy from natural gas from Russia. They had a bunch of competing interests, and they just decided that was the one thing they'd let go of the wayside was the strategic Russian angle, and it it was paying off. It was a risk that was paying off up until this year, right? So I think that there's going to be a lot of decisions that other countries are going to have to make a lot of those decisions in the face of the competing goals of having reliable, adequate energy, fighting climate change, but also strategic interest, right? Like there's, energy is already complicated enough without, say climate change playing a role. But with those three different kind of vectors, it's a very difficult balancing act for any country.
And to be clear about how the natural gas in Germany was working, or how it works in every country, the reason it's so good at offsetting renewables, so if you want to go strong on renewables, they're not a reliable source of electricity. Like the wind can be weak, or the summer can be too hot, and then your solar panels efficiency goes down. But you always have natural gas that you can increase the output of. So Germany has massive natural gas storage facilities, which run about 65% full right now, but they need those facilities for their demands over winter to be 80 to 90% full. And due to Russia's war in the Ukraine and weaponizing their energy, their goal is basically to not allow Germany to increase those stockpiles above 65%, to therefore force them to continue buying throughout the winter. And this is a position Germany put itself in, fully knowing that it gave Russia that type of leverage over them.
Yeah, and coupled with this, like they're also having problems with, you mentioned that solar, if it gets too hot, it loses efficiency and the wind starts being weak, you lose your power generation. And that's exactly what's happened over the last year or so. The Germany gets a huge amount of its power from wind farms in the North Sea, and the wind has been dismal there. And so they've lost a bunch of power, so they're going to have to burn more fossil fuels like coal and whatnot. And they've also had problems in Norway was another big supplier of Europe's power through electric dams, because they have a ton of them. And they sell a bunch of energy into Europe's grid, including Germany. Well, they've had drought problems, and so they haven't been producing as much hydro. And you couple that in, now Russia really has them over a barrel, because if those were working really well, they wouldn't have had to burn as much natural gas, and they could slowly increase their stores. But given that that's not the case right now, they're really struggling. And yeah, to Hubbard's point, it's a really fine balancing act, but it does seem like countries have made quite a large amount of poor choices when it comes to this, because I think
they just
they want their cake and eat it too, right? I think that's kind of that's a natural human tendency, and I think that is one exercised by the Germans and Europeans generally. Not to say that they're the only ones who have done that, but many countries have, and now it's really put Europe in a very bad spot.
Choosing to put a lot of faith in autocracies seems to be the solution a lot of countries went for this balancing act. And I think that segues nicely into what China is trying to achieve with their renewable goals, because in case people didn't know, China makes about, I believe, 80 to 90% of the solar panels in the world.
They make 80% right now, but they are forecasted to go up to 95% by 2025. So just a few years from now. That's the best estimate that I saw.
Their goal is to become the Russia of renewable energy,
Exactly.
And it seems like if we make the same compromise as in the Western democracies with China as we did with Russia, they'll have quite a similar sort of bargaining power.
And, for those who think, oh, well, like we get them cheap, it's okay. It's like, well, they're eyeing up Taiwan right now. And, if they want to go after that, and we're extremely reliant on the solar panels from China to make our green energy transition, well, then, they kind of have to give it to them, right? And so you can see how this is just turning into like a complete fiasco.
So America obviously loves to spend money on Chinese solar panels, and they're now investigating whether solar panels they've been buying from Southeast Asia are just basically getting laundered through Southeast Asia and then sold to America to avoid tariffs.
From solar panels from China, right? Like being launched
into Vietnam and Thailand and Cambodia, like these sort of places. Basically shipped there in pieces, and then the full assemblies finished there, and then they're shipped to America. And that's currently put 300 American projects on hold. It's meant that in 2021, they didn't put as many solar panels out as they did in 2020, and has increased the cost of solar projects in America. And according to Congress, probably Republicans, probably skewed, but it's threatening 100,000 American jobs in the renewable energy sector.
Yeah, I think just going back to Germany, that the one more crazy thing that is the nuclear. It's a fourth factor that you just put on. How do you factor that into the equation if your only option going forward for a lot of these places from an ideological standpoint is to have renewables that exclude nuclear? So you're left with like solar, wind, hydroelectric, couple other odds and ends basically. And the problem with that is, Price was explaining before why natural gas is so nice, because you can ramp up or ramp down the natural gas plants to make up for the inconsistent nature of a lot of renewable sources such as wind and solar. Well, the nuclear is actually somewhat similar in the sense that there are some difficulties with the reactor process that you can't necessarily ramp it down, but it is very reliable. It's not, nuclear does not, it's shut down for a day or whatever. It can be a backbone source of power for your grid. And without it, you're just like, you're forced into coal or natural gas or something right now. There's no technology there that can provide reliable, consistent power when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. There's just nothing to replace it. And the only hope, I guess, that of the kind of the ideologues of this like wind solar only movement cling to is like storage. Like, oh well, just build a bunch of battery capacity and then store your wind and solar when it's good and then use it. There's just no way that that's feasible in the next 10 years or 20 years to build storage capacity like that. So if you're putting yourself in a place where nuclear's off the table, you want to go green, you don't want to be beholden to an autocracy or some other sketchy foreign power that's not going to be reliable, and you want to meet the increasing demand for energy that most places are experiencing. Like, it's just something that can't happen. It's just not a possibility. So you have to pick your poison essentially. And I think, various countries have demonstrated the consequences of that. Like in even Japan is another example on the nuclear front where they shut down a bunch of nuclear. It didn't have great end results. If you look at it,
they're working on firing them back up this year because Japan was one of the progenitors of the liquid natural gas consumption, them in South Korea. And I'm not entirely certain about South Korea, but Japan has had to fire up their old nuclear reactors because the liquid natural gas market is so tight that it's just like you're competing with Europe at this point in a way that you've never had to compete as an Asian country before for the global market that is liquid natural gas. And it's just crazy. Even coal, for that matter, like the Australians who mine a ton of coal and have the largest coal ships in the world, the price for their coal has increased eightfold in a year, like from $50 per ton to $400 per ton.
And
Yeah,
that's
Like
wild.
anything,
That's like close to what the natural gas in Europe price has gone up. It's increased tenfold.
anything you can ship around the world to alleviate these pressures, there's a bidding war for. It's just crazy.
and we've touched on Japan and Europe primarily, and the US and stuff. Those are the countries that have the money to basically bid with each other and get the energy they need. For Germany or other European countries, it might suck. Like, they're going to pay a lot higher rates for their power. They might even have to ration with the Russian situation, depending. But like, they can still limp by. That excludes like a lot of the developing world, that they're going to be, up shit's creek with this situation, right? Like, tons of these countries are going to be net energy importers, especially for their fossil fuel needs, their oil and gas and coal, and they have no economic power to negotiate, and they're just not going to have energy, and that's going to crash their already comparatively weak economies. And what does that lead to? Civil unrest, right? Like, that's just going to be a direct result.
Stuff like that. Like,
so yeah, as bad as things are in Europe with the Russian situation and it's just going to be so much worse in parts of the world that don't have the option to just basically spend their way out of it. Yeah.
The worst thing in the developing world that it doesn't seem likely the developed world will really have to deal with is genuine food insecurity.
Yeah, I think the UN is predicting something like 150 million people in Africa are going to be food insecure.
Well, you need energy to run your farming equipment. I think most people understand that. But then one thing that I think a lot of people aren't aware of is that fertilizer is often derived, if not predominantly derived, from natural gas. Mm-hmm. So as the price of natural gas increases, the price of fertilizer increases. So not only will you not be able to afford to run your tractor in a low-income country, you won't even be able to afford the fertilizer if you could spread it by cow or something, because the fertilizer itself will increase 4 or 5 times in cost.
Well, and your transportation, if you're a net food importer, if you're importing your food, you're transporting it.
Yeah.
What's happening to transport costs as fuel costs skyrocket?
And then there's the
obvious
Russia-Ukraine war between the two largest exporters of wheat in the world, which is never good for anybody.
Yeah, like the energy, just as we talked about at the beginning, that's why it's so important. It feeds the economy. I think in a lot of ways you could think of it as like the primary input. Especially with how industrial we've become. There's not really any option. Like, you just can't do farming without modern farming without huge energy input. It's not possible. So it's not like we can just pare things down and we're good to go. Like, you have to keep the energy flows going, otherwise even the essential services start to collapse, especially in developing countries where they just don't have the option to buy their way out of it, right? And so I think end of the day we're going to see a lot of Sri Lankan like civil unrest over food insecurity, and energy increases, and energy increases are also playing into the food insecurity. So it's a lot of it. The root cause is the energy. Guys, got anything more to cover on the kind of current situation, or do we want to switch into more talking about like what it means for people in the next little while.
I think we could go to what it means. One last thing I wanted to mention, just as a number that I thought was interesting, is that coal energy generation has gone up, but has gone up slower than other forms of energy generation, which I think might not be common knowledge. I didn't know that. And therefore it's now, in the last 10 years. But it has now declined to only generating 36% of the world's electricity from a peak of 41%. So as a percentage, it's decreased, but the actual raw coal being burned in the world hit a new high. Well, actually, the coal being burned was slightly lower than all-time highs because coal plants have become more efficient. But the energy generated from coal hit an all-time high in 2021.
Well, I think, yeah, that's pretty crazy. The last one interesting thing is like we, with the pandemic, tons of things shut down, right? Like you had flights shut down, people going out shut down, like tons of what we'd consider normal life shut down, and yet our energy consumption only dropped a couple percent for the peak pandemic, and we're already back trending past our pre-pandemic levels. So it's like, I think people aren't quite like, it's not just all the excessive stuff we do that is like causing our energy consumption to be so high. Like a lot of that discretionary activity declined significantly for a year, and it only put a small dent in our energy consumption. So even like I think what most people would consider radical lifestyle changes that went along with the pandemic lockdowns and that stuff, those lifestyle changes aren't radical enough to put any sort of real dent in our energy use. So
you would need to basically return to monkey in order to actually push things way down, which is, you have to be a pretty daft human being to think that that's a reasonable proposition in terms of dealing with climate change or global energy problems, just given that.
Or you at least have to onboard the information that, again, like a lot of the quite strong green movement types think like, oh, well, radical lifestyle change is the answer. Well, it's like, it's got to be more radical than what we saw in the pandemic, a lot more radical, right? So,
a return to subsistence farming basically is what you'd be talking about.
Yeah, like it would be, life would be completely different under a, something like even a 15% global reduction in energy utilization would be like huge, an order of magnitude larger change in lifestyles for people than what we saw under the pandemic. So that's just something to consider. Like we have a bit of a data point on what a reduction in energy utilization looks like and what the lifestyle adjustment comes out to. And so if you're thinking that's the answer, we'll just consider what further lifestyle changes you'd be willing to make in terms of your own life in order to reach, say, a 10 or a 15 or 20% reduction in energy usage across the globe. It's going to be a lot more serious than what we had for the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely agree there. All right, let's move into the implications for just your everyday person. What'd you guys discern from all of your thorough research on this?
If you're European, emigrate. Come
to the States.
It's a common solution to European problems since at least the 1500s.
Yeah, that's true.
It's honestly kind of true. Stop being Euro poor and move somewhere with energy. But yeah,
basically North America.
Yeah, North America is a good one. Like if you look at the kind of very zoomed out, it is true. Like Asia and Europe are the two just massive net importers of energy, and it just really does leave you at the whims of the global strategic situation, right? Like it's not necessarily like you're going to be screwed over if you're a net energy importer. I mean, look at China. China's done amazingly well as a huge net energy importer for the last at least well over a decade. But that being said, it's a strategic vulnerability. It just is. So it's, I think, yeah, if you are in one of those regions, you might just want to see if you might want to pay extra attention in terms of things you could do to protect yourself, right? Like if you're in Canada, I think Canada is particularly well off in terms of just the energy situation. You might
we can
not
produce like all of our oil and gas needs locally.
Although you do have to qualify that Eastern Canada is a lot more isolated than people would think it is. For instance, when Michigan was going radical and trying to destroy a pipeline that fed Eastern Canada, the estimates were it would have just led to 10% of houses not being able to be heated, or like you'd lose 10% of what you required. Your bare minimum for heating, you'd be at like 90%
Yeah, I would have
of
killed
that.
tens of thousands of people just through freezing to death. Like that was one of the weirdest things I had ever seen in like North American politics, because what the Michigan governor was pretty much going to do was kill thousands upon thousands of Canadians, because it was at a time when it was cold as shit. Like they would not have. There would have been.
Yeah, it was the middle of winter.
Yeah, like,
and they want to cut off a pipeline.
Yeah, and that, like there exactly, and there was no way for those people to be able to heat their homes. Like it just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't like, oh well, you could, apart from setting a bonfire in the middle of your living room, you were not going to heat your house. Like if you were one of the ones who wouldn't get the supply that you needed, and if it's -20, -30, especially if you're like elderly or young, you will freeze to death. Just flat out. That happens all the time. Like people don't really know this, but thousands of people freeze to death every year in developed nations because like their heat gets cut off, they're old, they forget to pay the bill or something like that, they don't have somebody to help them out, and they freeze to death in their apartments or in their homes.
Really common one
It
is
happens
because they'll go by correlation of excess mortality too, and cold winters always have more mortality. And there's a lot of penny pinching elderly people who keep their houses relatively cold, and they'll just catch pneumonia and die when they otherwise shouldn't have.
Exactly. And so what that Michigan governor was actually saying is, yeah, we'll kill a bunch of Canadians. Who cares? It was just one of the weirdest things I had ever seen out of a North American politician.
Well, I mean, that's pretty crazy. But that aside, I mean, if you look at Canadian power, tons of it is generated through hydroelectric, like Quebec and BC is.
And
Quebec
Ontario's
and BC,
nuclear.
Yeah, it's a good chunk of Ontario. Is nuclear. We have lots of fossil fuels, more than we're a net exporter of fossil fuels, obviously, and we have huge reserves. So somewhere like Canada, and even the U.S. is actually, and now for the last few years has been a net energy exporter, and they're pretty well positioned as well, the U.S., which bodes well for Canada in addition, because we have a big neighbor with good energy resources as well. So
the most disappointing thing as a Canadian when you talk about individual people and politics and what matters is that we've consistently elected governments that are anti-energy development in Canada. And now this year, you frequently see Trudeau touring around Europe saying how Canada is going to help solve Europe's energy crisis because they're too reliant on Russia, which if we had not actively impeded our corporations in Canada, our energy companies, we could have helped with, because LNG can be shipped to Europe, or oil could be pipelined to Eastern Canada and then shipped to Europe. But we never built the pipeline to Eastern Canada from Western Canada, and we haven't finished any LNG projects, which have been pared down from 4 to 1 as it stands, and that one was supposed to open 4 years ago and still hasn't opened yet. It's just
is that the Trans Mountain one?
no, that's the Coastal Gas Link,
Oh yeah, and that got
and that was
terrorist
recently
attack.
attacked by terrorists.
Yeah.
What would you even call it? They claim to represent the interests of the native tribe up there, but many of the natives up there were not happy that they would go out and spill thousands of liters of oil and gas from this construction equipment just into the environment. It was not a very effective protest.
Well, it wasn't a protest; it was a full-blown terrorist attack because they attacked.
Yeah, I'm
People
saying
with
from their
axes.
point of view, though. From
Yeah.
their point of view, like if you're genuinely trying to I don't even think they have a representative, but like allegedly they would be trying to stop the Coastal Gas Link from happening, and that's not a way to do it that would have any good effect.
Yeah, it certainly hasn't made them more popular.
So basically, stopping the Coastal Gas Link would mean we could never do anything to help Europe, which is pretty much the practical case because it'll take another year or two to finish at least. But
Yeah, and just Canada, by the time Europe needs gas now. They don't need it in 2 years. They'll need it in 2 years, but they have an immediate problem, day by day problem. And
yeah, like
it
we're
takes
not
a
capable.
it takes a long time to build up those facilities required to ship stuff over there. It's not, you can't whip them up in 6 weeks. Some of them are going to take years to complete. And so I would 100% agree with you, Price. We've had government after government, like federal and local, like provincial and local ones as well, especially in BC, who have scuttled those plans consistently. And I also think the ESG rating has also scuttled this stuff because, companies want to get their ESG scores up because otherwise, if they're a public company, they can't really get investors, and therefore they can't really gain access to more capital to be able to do anything. So they have to pare back on all of those types of, additional fossil fuel investments. And so, it's definitely put Canada's energy sector in probably the worst place it could have been in terms of just being able to help out with the crisis and in Europe and just generally assist with the transition to green. I think a lot of people, green activist types, think that you can just build a bunch of solar and it's all going to work. But one of the things that I don't know how much we discussed this, you cannot power your heavy equipment, your big trucks, your planes, your boats. You cannot power the huge amount of transportation infrastructure required to keep everything from falling apart. You can't power that through electricity generated by something like wind or solar. It's not going to happen. And so you're going to need these resources like oil and not natural gas, because that's not exactly the same thing, but you have to have those oil oil products basically to power all of that transportation network. And the fact that we don't have an option to not do that, because you're not going to be able to stick a big Tesla battery in a massive transport ship. It's just, unless you want to build nuclear reactors and stick them in there, you don't have a choice.
Transport's a solved problem. Have you heard of this large piece of cloth that some may call a sail?
Figured it out. Thank you, Price. I think we just solved the entire gas crisis here on the podcast.
Yeah,
Good
easy.
job. God, we should be running the country.
Well, I think that conversation goes to what you can do as a person in terms of political considerations, when you're choosing to vote, who should you vote for? Well, again, it does always come down to your own values, but I think, as we discussed, there's 3 or 4 competing vectors of where the energy system is going. You have to sacrifice something, right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts. You have to sacrifice something. You have to pick your poison.
Is really pertinent here. There's no such thing as a solution, only trade-offs. And so, yeah, you really are stuck with a compromise, not some sort of solution that makes everything good. It's not going to happen that way.
Yeah, so I think you have to either leave your you have the strategic sacrifice like Germany made, where you're just leaving your country open to an
Coercion.
an energy exporter that is an autocracy and led by a very psychopathic and manipulative person that doesn't have your best interests or the share your values, or you can kibosh nuclear, or so you have to pick your personal mix. But for me, I guess personally, I think the one thing that I think is just an easy trade-off for me to make is just go full hog on nuclear. It just, the downside of that plan to me just seems the lowest of the low.
Especially with the new types of nuclear plants, which actually Canada is like the world's leader in. Like they're not the type of plants, like for those who are super scared of nuclear, they're not the type of plants, if they lose power, that melt down and then blow out radiation all over the place. They cycle down and then you have to just reboot them once you get power. So if power is knocked out, it's not the same anymore. And there are advances in nuclear technology that could also make it a lot safer, in the sense that you don't have enriched uranium as a requirement. And
yeah, but what you're forgetting is that enriched uranium is the real reason most countries want nuclear reactors. So if your nuclear reactor doesn't require enriched uranium, it's a non-starter.
Well, and I think that's where, like as a voter, you'd have to make a informed choice on that, where, pushing the governments towards reactors that are not going to cause that, like a proliferation of fissile material that can be used in bombs. Like I really do think that's, and we had some politicians in the States who were banging that drum, which was good to see. Too bad they didn't.
You also have
than they did.
India as a you have India as a country banging that drum. Seems like India is making moves towards thorium reactors, which is modern thorium reactors, which are safe and
they do run CANDU reactors as well, which are the ones that don't need enriched uranium, and they're nuclear power. So it's really, they're quite altruistic in their nuclear pursuits.
Yeah, well, they have a ton of thorium reserves, so it does make sense for them. Like they won't have to. I mean, that is another consideration for nuclear that I guess is pertinent for countries. Is like, how much uranium or thorium or whatever other material that you're going to use do you actually mine in your own country? Like, again, Canada has tons of uranium, so we're fine. We can just source our own. We never have to rely on any other country for ours in the long term.
And I think, and I think for a country like Canada, then it's, it makes much more sense, right? You're not putting yourself in a poor strategic spot. You're also dealing with climate change. You're, proofing the grid. You're not having a bunch of old crappy reactors like the one in Fukushima that, if it loses power, it's going to actually blow up. And so, like, I 100% agree with you, is pumping nuclear power as much as you can, that within reasonable limits, of course, is something that I think it's just a no-brainer at this point. Like if you want to deal with climate change and you don't want to be reliant on people like Putin for gas, and you have the technology and you have the reserves yourself, it's just the fact that we haven't gone nuclear fully yet, or not fully, but like massively pumped up nuclear in Canada, is a little disheartening.
Interestingly, on nuclear front, China wants to produce 150 nuclear reactors in the next 30 years. And that's more nuclear reactors than currently exist in the world, I think. It would be pretty incredible.
Do they have pretty big uranium deposits? I thought they actually did have some.
I believe they have good uranium deposits.
Yeah, I think that was
haven't
one of the
looked too deeply into it.
I think one of the reasons they wanted to do it is because they actually had that, and so they could just extract it themselves, and they didn't have to worry about the same problems we were just discussing. What are some other thoughts that you have for just like the general public?
Well, again, like I was saying a little bit before, in terms of if you are in a place that, well, I think anywhere you are, the point of the governor cutting the pipeline is a good point, because even if on the kind of surface level your country looks fine or your situation looks fine, you never know. If you are just stuck on the grid, you never know what's going to happen. Your politician could make a very stupid decision for you that screws you over in the long run. So I think just anyone that is looking into it, like you could look at ways to become as or as efficient as possible in terms of your own energy utilization, and B, maybe generate some of your own power.
That was going to be one of my points. Like, if you live in a place that is conducive to solar, I think it is well worth tossing them on your own route, like on your house. That's what I'm going to do. I think it makes a ton of sense, and especially in Canada, where there's quite a bit of incentives and basically free money from the government to do so. I think you definitely protect yourself in case power spikes up or something like that. Even though Canada is in a better situation than a lot of places, power costs have gone up quite a bit here. So it's not a bad thing to do that. Just being a little bit more self-sufficient, self-reliant, that certainly does not hurt at all. Like, it's only really a net positive.
And even with only a few solar panels, in a worst case scenario, you can run important functions in your house.
Yeah.
Keep your pipes from freezing. Like, you might not be able to run the refrigerator and the washer and dryer, but you could heat your home if you're going to die otherwise.
Well, that's another thing you can consider, is diversifying your energy mix, I guess, right? So if you have a house, maybe consider having electric heat and natural gas heat, right, as an option, because as we've seen, not all energy sources are necessarily going to be hit at the same time. Like, it's all about, for individuals, I think especially, it's about being flexible and resilient, because it doesn't matter if what the long-term trends are, if in the moment your gas is shut off, right? Like, I've seen some stories out of Germany where people are getting their gas shut off as they try to mitigate the gas usage. And if you have electric power as a backup, and especially if you have your own, power generation, solar panels or something, then you're just covered. You can keep the basics going. You can keep yourself alive at the very least.
Yeah, or keep yourself out of complete misery for a couple of weeks, right?
Texan or Albertan, and your electrical generation is your natural gas, and then it's like pretty hard to diversify.
If you're Texan, Albertan, then solar panels are likely, if you live in a home, pretty good option.
Oh yeah, solar panels are very good.
Exactly.
So, like especially in Alberta, it's pretty windy. Like, you could even chuck in.
Wind doesn't have the dollar efficiency of solar panels.
Yeah, at the moment, for sure.
Because the thing with wind is, the larger your windmill, the more cost efficient it is. So
you don't want to
huge ones Germany puts in the North Sea, I believe, are a little bit more expensive than solar farms. But the smaller you go on a wind turbine, the more expensive the energy it generates is.
Good point. But again, like the broader point being is, if if we're more or less right, and the world is in for a bit of a rocky road in terms of energy over the next couple decades, it's like diversifying anything else, right? Like, diversify your energy profile for yourself, and be hooked up to the grid, but also maybe have your own generation and even your own storage. Like, home batteries are becoming
electric cars, actually. Like, an electric car is a backup power source for your house, which a lot of people kind of sleep on as a bonus to buying an electric car.
That's true.
You actually get quite a bit.
I think the long range for Lightning is about 2 or 3 days of an average household's power utilization in terms of battery storage in the vehicle.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, and that gets you through most crises. Like, most crises aren't going to last more than 4 days unless something categorically changes.
And that's another thing too, is like, electric vehicles might also be a reasonable way to diversify away from, reliance on fossil fuels, because again, especially depending where you are, the electric grid might be more reliable than the fossil fuel situation in a lot of places going forward, because it's just there's a lot more options for generating power than there are for getting more oil out of the ground. Like if oil, we touched on it very briefly, but Con was saying like we might be somewhere in the neighborhood of peak oil, and oil is going to get harder and harder to pull out of the ground. And that's going to mean it's going to get exponentially more expensive. And I mean, if you look at the analysis, it doesn't take a lot of like shortage in terms of supply versus demand for price spikes to get absolutely ludicrous. Like, right at this moment, I was seeing numbers thrown around where if we currently consume around 100 million barrels of oil per day, if I'm not mistaken. And
somewhere around there.
With the Russia-Ukraine thing, it's a little difficult, but like we're around, basically supply and demand were somewhat balanced. And like if you go and look at the analysis, even with a couple million barrels per day in shortage, which is only a couple percentage in terms of shortage, that the price of oil is, estimated to spike up over $300 a barrel. So, just think about what that does to your gas prices. Well, yeah, it's insane. So if you do have an electric vehicle, you're insulated from that. And obviously they're not cheap, but yeah, I just think
become cheaper. So, like going forward as like a purchaser, maybe if you need to buy a car in the next 5 years or so, maybe something to consider. Obviously they're not going to become
well, but
but there might be some pretty good options in the next 5 years.
Given the like limited mining for green materials that go into building electric batteries, it seems a little optimistic right now to think they'll be going down significantly, because your battery is your biggest cost in an electric vehicle. They'll probably be, I would imagine they'd be hovering around. I don't know actually how they've been affected by the weird shortages in chips, because most vehicles should be going back down in price, but I don't know about electrics, is basically what I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing to consider in terms of electric pricing that's affected it in the last little while is just gas being high. People have extremely short memories. Gas has gone down like 20 or 30 cents in the last few months versus like all-time peak in the spring. And if you go and look at the numbers, compact car sales are already declining. They're the fastest falling vehicle sale.
Oh man, it's under $2 we're good.
Literally that is the consumer mind. That is how short term consumers are. Like, a month later the price of gasoline drops 20 cents and boom, all this of a sudden buying decisions on vehicles shifts substantially in terms of, fuel economy preference. So I think if we do have some sustained period of relatively affordable gasoline, I think electric vehicles might kind of decline a little bit in terms of sales, just because people will not be as impressed by the savings. And I mean, that's a good point for consumers. Like, go counter trend. Like when gas is cheap, buy that efficient vehicle or that electric vehicle, probably because that's the perfect time to buy it, because demand's going to be lower. And same with like even solar panels and the like. I'm sure I haven't looked into it deeply, but I bet when power costs spike, your solar project, your home do-it-yourself solar project, it just goes crazy and the prices increase. And then if there's a lull, that's the perfect time to go and look into it and get it done. It's
like your air conditioning. Buy your air conditioning in the winter, because if you wait till the summer, they're all sold out.
Yeah.
Oh, so actually, that's a good one for what people can do. I've looked into this, and I mean, if you have the money, central air conditioning is nice, but the cost savings of just air conditioning your primary 1 or 2 rooms in your house over air conditioning your whole house are incredible. Like it's like 1/10 of the electrical cost in a big house.
Yeah, I'd be interested to see if I bet there's a increasing like smart central air systems that, you know what I mean, that integrate some of
they'll
that.
turn off zones of your house, or like your whole house will heat up while you're at work. You can do that sort of stuff. But when I was running the numbers for like my own household, the difference would be basically $30 to $50 a year versus like $300 to $500 a year with central air, like running one in one room versus running one for the whole house.
Yeah,
And then
that's pretty
obviously
substantial.
way lower upfront input costs on of room size versus a house size.
True, very true.
And it'll keep you alive. You're not going to get heat stroke if you have an air conditioned room.
I can attest. Survived with a portable AC through the BC heat craziness. That was 40-degree temperature. It was
I did not have
lifesaver.
AC, and that damn near killed my cats. It was actually terrible. I had to sit in the car at like 3 o'clock in the morning with the AC running, just like the car running, because the cats were actually going to overheat and die. It was wild. And then immediately after, went and snagged AC for the next summer to keep the one room cold.
I genuinely wonder if that's going to scale up to being a government problem, because governments are already recommending people keep their houses hotter because of the electrical grid, because AC burns so much energy. But I wonder if countries will start trying to find ways to actually limit how much AC people have access to. Like,
I wouldn't be
surprised.
Yeah, I could see that.
I mean, AC units are already expensive. Like the portable ones have already gone up, and there's like fees on them already.
Yeah.
Government fees. So there's already like a method to make them unaffordable for.
You got a license for that AC?
Yeah, exactly.
AC licenses, boys. That's the future.
Just put an AC dock fee or whatever at like $1,500, and then only your, elite politicians and crony capitalists can afford AC anymore. But yeah, I think going back to energy use, there is just like simple ways to cut down on your power without making your life any worse. And there's also ways to generate power. Like I think
I would also
right now is the golden age for home do-it-yourself solar.
Another big one is Windows. The government of Canada, and I'm sure other governments, will pay you a certain grant to get your windows replaced with high efficiency windows. And that can easily save you 10% on heating. And if you're running AC, it'll be similar.
Yeah, there you go. Like and then power efficient appliances, all sorts of things that you can, and like you're saying, price, like there's government money for it. Like you can get subsidized. Yeah, depending where you live, you can actually just get government subsidies right now to cover your ass in the future. And again, I think like the worst case scenario is that technology advances and things get better in terms of the energy situation, and you just kind of break even on your energy efficiency. The worst case scenario is you just kind of break even on or maybe lose a little bit of money on your efficiency and self-generated power situation, right? If kilowatt hours don't, substantially increase in Canada or wherever you are in the next decade, your solar system investment won't look quite as nice, but it'll still be fine. It'll still be probably a reasonable investment.
Especially if you're in Canada, since a lot of it is subsidized. So, like, you can get up to $12,000 or something, which covers like a huge chunk of your installation. I think it was
at current rates, counting the subsidies, it's like around 15 years to pay off the solar panels if prices don't go up. And even if they go down, that should pay off within 20 years. So you should not lose money if you're getting subsidized to put solar panels in. It's just how much money will you save? It will vary.
Yeah, and I think it is quite unlikely that we'll see energy prices remain the same for the next 20 years. Like basic inflation, like unless we do have some pretty wild breakthroughs in efficiency, I don't, especially over the next like several years, like you'd definitely be getting your money's worth there, and then maybe it starts to go down a bit, but in terms of like your return, but at the same time, yeah, I see it being overall just a net positive, very likely.
Well, it's just like very, I think a very hard to pass up opportunity to self-insure, right? Like you,
Yeah, exactly.
worst case scenario, it's not quite the best investment you ever made with your money. You probably, end of the day, you might have been better off putting the cash in the S&P 500 or whatever. But I mean, best case scenario, you're saving yourself a huge amount of A, money potentially, and B, actual physical heartache and stress and struggle and potentially,
Yeah, especially if you have like a Powerball,
serious thing.
like a Tesla Powerball type thing, and you can get some pretty crazy weather, and even just being able to carry on through that with your power when everybody else doesn't have it, be
Speaking of
probably well
Powerwalls,
worth thousands of bucks.
similar to cars, although since you drive your car, you can't really use it exactly in this fashion. But there are a lot of jurisdictions in the States, and I imagine all over the world, where you pay varying rates for electricity depending on demand. And there's states in America where you can easily pay off your power wall in like 10 to 15 years just based off of charging it at night and using its energy to run your house during the day.
That's a good point. You charge yourself up during cheap times and draw down when it's too expensive. Yeah.
Yeah, because in the jurisdictions that I've seen, it's like double the price during peak hours for electricity.
Yeah, I just think it's for so many people that haven't lived through any like actual real energy crises. It's going to be a kick in the teeth if anything does happen, and I'd rather just not be completely subject to the whims and of the government and just the energy global energy markets. Like there's a lot of uncertainty there, and there's very little you can do to control any of that. So
Yeah, one last
there
thing
is
I would say
fuels
about
there.
that too is, another thing that you can do, because we were talking about food insecurity, having like your own little garden is not a bad idea too for certain months if you have the space for it. I think gardening is pretty therapeutic, and if you can produce some of your own food, obviously you're not going to be able to produce all the food that you can eat, but having a little bit of a buffer and a hobby that is enjoyable, it's not a bad way to go. Now, obviously, I would say most people are not in a position where they can plant like a big garden, tear up a couple hundred square meters or something like that. But, there are small things like that you can do that could buffer it, especially, there's some sort of big pest that rips through and gets, kills all the lettuce or something like that. Well, you got your own for at least a bit. It's not too bad. But that's not as practical, but I do think, especially for those who are placed in situations where they could actually run like a much larger garden, it's not a bad idea.
I think the way to look at gardening is that small scale, it's like a nice hobby that's actually has positive mental health effects. And it's also a skill that you can take care of a plant, and you've grown a plant. Like growing plants is not as easy as 90% of people think it is.
No.
And so if you can take care of a couple container plants in some sort of dystopian future, you could take care of a couple hundred container plants. Like you could scale up that skill if you ever somehow needed to.
That's true. I think to add to that too, also just being conscious of if you're not gardening yourself, but just like where you get your food and your community, like where is your food sourced, and like the lifestyle you like, maybe just take a self-reflection on like how run the math on like, okay, if there was like a crazy energy shock, like how much of my lifestyle would have to change going forward. Like where do I get my food? Is it locally grown? Is it locally sourced? Is like what are the inputs to that? Obviously you're never going to be able to fully understand where everything comes from and all that stuff, but just having like a basic idea of like how reliant your lifestyle is on cheap fossil fuels and affordable, reliable energy, and then maybe like something like gardening, or there could be other ways that you could mitigate your exposure to the most kind of sensitive to loss pillars there, where like if energy does triple in price or oil goes up to $400 a barrel, what's going to change in your life, and already have a plan to substitute out of that. Like, and 100% gardening is a great example of maybe my fruits and vegetables will not be able to be shipped in from especially Canadians, where tons of our varied produce is imported because we don't have the best growing conditions for much of our fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. So you have a little greenhouse that you grow things that would disappear in the case of $400 oil. Well, there you go.
Yeah. One last thing that I'd put on there too is somebody that I was listening to on this topic had a really good point, and his point was you should probably be pretty well connected into your community and being like integrated into that, because if there are some pretty big, like if there is a truly big energy shock, that will cause some severe disruptions in your life. Like, you're not getting away from that. And the only way that you really make it through those things is by having like a good community around you and like a good lifestyle that can carry you through that. Because if you don't, you're far more at the whims of like whatever problems are going to crop up from that. But having that strong community, you've got a good healthy lifestyle as well, you're going to be able to weather those storms like through banding together with your friends. And yeah, especially if you have a pretty nasty energy shock, like you might see huge problems in the medical system. And so, if you're pretty unhealthy, well, you might be shit out of luck in terms of, like if you needed certain medications and stuff like that, well, you might not be able to get those anymore. And being able to, this isn't to say you turn into a doomsday prepper, only like sit in your hole and be terrified of the world. But it is good to have those contingency plans, and also being plugged into the community and being healthy will help you weather storms like much better than those who are not. I thought that was a great point that he made. Speaking of the, I consider more strongly now.
The doomsday preppers, I mean, in my personal experience, I feel like there's people who thinking about these things, it's just an abject negative for them, and they don't actually, they don't improve their life position. They just think, oh, the world's terrible and it's going to end and this is horrible. Then, I mean, you're probably just better off not thinking about it.
Yeah.
But people like me, I would say, as an example, like I like thinking about this stuff, because then it's, if it ever does happen, I've thought of it, like I've walked it through, and it gives me a level of comfort. So it's a mental positive, like totally, I don't see anything wrong with it. But I think there are people where they should, for their own mental health, not worry too much about all this stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's true, because if you're prone to catastrophizing and getting into those downward spirals, then then your own personal life is going to fall apart, and that that's going to be a consistent, persistent theme in your life, and that's going to compound on top of everything comparatively to just having like the shock that comes through and you're not prepared. But it's better than being a complete
lived a good life until then.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't have to be a basket case until that point and then still like just get wiped out by it. I do think that's a good point, Price. But that's it for me, unless you guys got any more points. Anything that you wanted to bring up that we forgot to cover?
No, I think we went through most of it.
Yeah, pretty good.
All right. Thanks a lot for listening. Peace.